Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Econ Live from the woods. I feel like I can squeeze one more in here before it gets dark. I have to go inside and go with the whole bookshelf motif. So, try to squeeze this one in here. So, you've heard me allude many times over the course, first of doing government last semester and then doing economics this semester. You've heard me allude many times to the problem of the national debt, the issue that a tremendous percentage of our government's budget is having to go toward just paying interest on the debt that we have. And so after a while, you hear people talk about there's going to be a pending, one day there's going to be a financial crisis is going to come. You hear people talk about it, and I've started to hear people say, well, it hadn't really come the way people thought, maybe it's not a big deal. And I sort of understand why some people wonder about that, except that it's just basic math. At some point, something's going to come due. And when we talk about the national debt, it's not like it's owed to one person or that the whole thing is due at once. Just like your personal debt, you may owe some to your car dealer and some to the person you bought your house from and some to, where you bought whatever other foolish decisions got you in trouble, whether it's golf carts or jet skis or whatever it was, right? So, and all those bills may come due at different times, but you're still in that amount of debt. So it's not like there's like one day where we've got to pay back this $2 trillion or whatever, $6 trillion, whatever it is now. I almost quit paying attention a while ago because it just kept getting bigger. But it is many different creditors are owed along the way, and so we'll talk about like what it actually means. So there's three different categories that a budget can fall into. So you can have a balanced budget, and that is where the money that comes in matches the money that goes out. And this would be a great goal. Some states have balanced budget amendments where the state government is required to balance the books. It would be virtually impossible for the feds to do that, although that's been a conservative goal for a long time, was to get a balanced budget amendment. I would be shocked if it ever passed, because there's so many political incentives to run huge deficits. And the reason that there's political incentives to run huge deficits, as I mentioned in the last lesson the other day, is because, Republicans love tax cuts and Democrats love spending increases. And the easiest way to get a bipartisan budget compromise passed is to include some of both. So, with that being the case, that's going to leave you with big gaps of having to borrow money to pay, because when you're taking in less money and paying more out, you have to borrow. And there's a scriptural principle. The Bible says that the borrower is servant to the lender. And so at some point, when you borrow from people, you kind of give them a position of power. Now, on the other hand, it's also a matter of wisdom that, and this is where the people that are kind of less concerned about the deficit like to point this out, though, is the difference between this and you taking out a big credit card debt is that some of the people that we're indebted to, they owe us so much money that if we were to cut them loose completely, it would be worse for them than it is for us. And so that's maybe the one thing where there's still some leverage for the United States government on that. So you've got a balanced budget, where is what comes in goes out. Then you've got what you call a budget surplus, which is rare, and that is where the federal budget's laid out, and then the government collects more money than was spent. And this has only happened 5 times in the last 50-odd years. In 2000, when at the end of the kind of Clinton-Gingrich era of the 90s, when Al Gore and George W. Bush were running for president against each other, one of the dominant questions of the campaign is, what do we do with the budget surplus? Because Bush said we've got extra money, so we should turn it into tax cuts. And Gore said we've got extra money, so we should turn it into spending programs. But either way, the idea was, there was billions of dollars that the government didn't have set aside for anything, that could just sit there. And they were arguing about how to spend it. Fast forward a decade or two now, and the situation's changed dramatically. We're trillions with a T in debt. I remind you that $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. Furthermore, I want to remind you that a billion is 1,000 million. So to be in debt $1 trillion means you have to, hold on, let me make sure I'm doing mine. Does that mean, so remember, so does that mean 100,000 million? Is that right? Oh my God, I hope that's not right. I hope I'm doing my math wrong, because that's insane. That's how much money that the United States government is in debt. So in a year, you have a budget surplus, you got a balanced budget, and then you've got a budget deficit, which a budget deficit is a year where the money that goes out is less than what comes in, which of course requires you to borrow said money in order to spend it. And the national debt, so every year that we don't at least break even, there is a deficit. So there's an annual deficit, and the sum total of the bits of the annual deficit that have not been paid off yet equals the national debt. So the national debt is this year's deficit plus the unpaid parts of last year's deficit plus the unpaid parts of the deficit from the year before that, etc. And so that figure just keeps getting higher and higher, because very rarely are things really getting paid off. So So what causes the deficit? There's been a number of things that have driven it. One thing is national emergencies. For instance, this coronavirus thing came out of nowhere, and in order to kind of try to stimulate the economy and prop it back up and keep just widespread business failures and so on, they came out and passed a $2 trillion couple, at least one, but I think it was two or three spending bills that all have been in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and one of them was like 1.5 trillion. So guess what? We had to borrow that. We were already running a deficit. This whole coronavirus thing is a real good example of why you shouldn't be running deficits in peace and prosperity, because everything's going fine. The economy's doing well. We don't have any, we still have a few troops in Afghanistan, but it's winding down. We don't have any major national security things that we're working on. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to get our financial house in order. And then a crisis like this happens where you just have to borrow $1 trillion. It's almost the only choice they have. And now that $1 trillion is being added to a tremendous pile of cash that they already owe. So national emergencies are some of it. Here's the hard thing for people to hear. The main drivers of the national debt are the four things that no one wants to cut, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and national defense. Liberals do not want to cut the first. Actually, really, almost no one wants to cut Social Security. Everyone, any politician that even talks about cutting Social Security gets, pilloried. Paul Ryan talked about some very, very modest changes to how it works, raising the retirement age by a couple years and dropping the rate by like a percentage point or two, And, his opponent in the next congressional race did an ad that showed someone who looks like him throwing a grandma out of a wheelchair down a hill. So no one wants to touch that. So that's part of it. Social Security, the thought was it would kind of pay for itself because it has a separate tax, the payroll tax, that is employees and employers match, both put 7.5% of the income in, and the idea was, with the first generation that put it in, the idea is we've got so many retirees and stuff that need to be taken care of, their children will pay into it now, and that'll fund their grandpa's Social Security, but by the time that they're a grandpa, their grandkids will be able to pay for them. And pay it in relative proportion to what they put in, which is why people feel entitled to their Social Security and don't look at it as welfare, because they said, I've been paying into this. Well, actually, you were paying for somebody else's, and now you're taking from somebody else. But, you think it evens out for you. The problem is we stopped having so many children. When they came up with it, everybody had 8, 10, 12 kids. And nowadays they don't. And so the population growth did not keep pace. And so now we're spending a lot more money on Social Security than we ever dreamed. Then you add Medicare and Medicaid, and Social Security nobody wants to touch. President Bush had a great idea that I think would have worked very well, modeled after something they did in Chile, where he would have enabled people to take some of their money out of Social Security and put it into private stocks and investments. but no one would go near it. Even with a Republican Congress for much of that time, he couldn't get anyone to bite on it. It's a shame. So no one wants to touch Social Security. Democrats do not want to touch Medicare and Medicaid under any circumstances. Republicans don't want to touch defense spending under any circumstances, with the exception of a handful of the more libertarian Republicans like Rand Paul and Mike Lee and some of that crew. But the vast majority of Republicans, still, want to spend lots of money on defense. Well, those are the four things that are driving the debt, because we're spending tremendous amounts of money on all those things. And as much as we love to tell stories about, the government spent $10 million studying the mating habits of, a certain type of fly in the Sahara, or, the government spent, $100,000 funding, a cowboy poetry festival. As much as we want to talk about all those goofy stories, the reality is you could get rid of all that. You could get rid of all the waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, and you still wouldn't make a dent. You wouldn't make but a couple percentage points change in the national debt, because those four things, the four things that everyone considers untouchable, everyone wants a solution. Like, how can we fix the national debt without cutting defense, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? Answer: you can't. It's impossible. But that's what everyone keeps hunting for, and because no one wants to touch those four things for the sake of re-election, and I understand why people want to protect those things, because obviously they're, Medicare and Medicaid are important to the people that are on it. Social Security is important to the people that are drawing it, and the defense is important to anyone who doesn't want to wind up running the risk of being conquered by foreign powers, which would be most of us. So yeah, I understand why that reality is, but it is what it is. So that's kind of what the debt is about. There's so many things that are expected of the government, and then you have crises. Especially a lot of the current deficit has to do with the Iran and Iraq wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. We haven't gone to war with Iran officially yet, although there certainly were some skirmishes with Iranian-based troops in Iraq. But so how exactly? So if we're spending $1 trillion a year plus more than we take in, where are we getting that money? Well, we're borrowing that money, and the mechanism by which we borrow that money is through the sale of savings bonds. If you remember back a few episodes, us talking about stocks and bonds. And so the savings bonds that are being sold by the Treasury, they are sold with a certain value in mind and a certain interest rate up until they mature. And so who is the question I always get asked when people ask about the national debt, well, who are we actually indebted to? And the answer is, the short answer is bondholders. We're indebted to the people that have bought Treasury bonds that at some point have to be paid off. So the national debt may be to you, right? Maybe someone, maybe your grandma might have bought you a savings bond when you were a kid to help pay for college or whatever. Well, congratulations. Part of the national debt is owed to you. So a lot of the bondholders are private actors, whether it's private citizens who bought to help save for retirement or kids' college fund or something. But the vast majority of that money is by banks, major corporations sometimes might do it. One thing that is a little bit of a concerning thing is in recent years, how many of these bondholders have been foreign investment. In particular, the national banks of foreign countries, most notably China and Japan. Now, being in debt to Japan is pretty benign, because they're a good country that mainly treats people pretty well on the international stage. But China is a little concerning, because they're our predominant opponent in the whole global superpower race. And obviously, this is the all-time low point of American-Chinese relationships, probably right now. So you could see how maybe, owing the Chinese Communist Party $700 billion is maybe not a good thing. I don't know if that's the number, but, just hypothetically. It is actually the case that it is $744 billion is what Chinese investors were owed in February 2009, when your book was right around when your book was printed. So that may have changed significantly one way or the other in the past 10 years. But I'm assuming it would probably go up, if anything. So, you can see how, we might not like how much of this debt is owed to foreign governments now, for the sake of, they have means of retaliation, perhaps. Some of the government deficit figure isn't as bad as it looks at times, because a lot of it is owed by parts of the government to itself. So there are certain government programs that have what they call trust funds, where the money is like locked into that program. Social Security is the most famous of these. And in the event, like let's say in a given year, that the government collects more in Social Security taxes than it actually has to pay out in Social Security, they'll invest the rest of that money in buying government bonds to help fund the operation of the rest of the government. So it's money that had already been budgeted for, and then they, go invest it with interest, and then at some point, they might hypothetically, pay back the Social Security program or the Medicare program or whatever, with interest at some point. That's not really economically that damaging, because we owe it to ourselves. It's not a big deal, and there's a certain percentage of the debt that is that. However, there's not enough of it that is that to make up for all the rest that we owe to exterior sources. Now, again, some facts about the national debt as of that are here on page 465 of your textbook, and this is based on a time period where the debt was in a different place than it is now. A stack of $100 bills totaling the national debt would stand 5,790 miles high. 5,790 miles up of hundos, of Ben Franklins. That's how much it would take to pay off the national debt as of 2009. If everyone in the United States helped to pay off the national debt, everyone said, we're just going to chip in and pay an equal amount to paying off the national debt, each person's share would be 28 grand. So it would take, more than a year of my salary to pay in my contribution, and every other person would have to make the same contribution. The U.S. Bureau of Engraving prints about $635 million worth of currency every day. That's the ones that actually print the dollars. At this rate, it would take more than 36 years to print enough money to pay it off. And where the debt is really damaging is the debt as percentage of GDP. So what is your nation's national debt compared to the overall health of their economy? And, the problem is, our percentage as part of GDP keeps growing and is going to grow and is going to grow more and more, especially if we have enough emergencies like what has happened this year. With that, it becomes a thing whereby there will be a certain point, economists have shown, if the models hold and everything, there will be a certain point within the next 15 years where the number one thing that the government spends money on is interest payments on the national debt. Is paying out interest to the bondholders who bought bonds, and they bought bonds that typically last anywhere between 10 and 30 years with the higher interest rates on the ones that take longer times to mature. And so there can be, this is just obvious. If I, you may not have developed your own household budget yet, but I think it would be obvious that if you're making 30 grand a year and you're spending 40 grand a year, that, there's a problem. But evidently our friends in Washington did not get that memo about basic mathematics. So what are the actual problems that come from this, since we seem to have been able to get away with it for a little while and still have a decent economy? What are the problems? Well, one of the problems that happens is the crowding out effect, where in order to keep borrowing money at this rate, the government sometimes will have to start bidding against private people that are trying to sell bonds, bidding against corporate bonds and stuff like that. And it causes a crowding out effect where everyone wants to buy government bonds because they think they're generally safer, because, the government can tax people and print money and do all these other things to pay it off. So people don't want to invest in private sources, which hurts the economy overall, because businesses can't get rolling, because some of their primary means of fundraising for expansion and so forth is off the table with the crowding out. So that's one problem that you have. Now, how do you fix the problem? There's a couple of different ways that you can approach fixing the problem of paying off the national debt, but they all have a downside. So the first one is, we have the power of the U.S. Mint, and I've even heard some columnists write columns calling for this. Why don't we just print a $6 trillion coin and pay it all off? Just print more money. We can make more money appear. Well, that is technically true. The problem with that is the real world is not immune to the law of scarcity. And if you just print more money to pay off the debt, what you'll do is you'll cause massive, massive, massive hyperinflation. Everyone's life savings would be rendered meaningless overnight. The prices of every product would skyrocket. And so you would have inflation at such a high rate, it would be a situation like what happened in Germany in the 1920s when we talked about them having to go take, wheelbarrows of cash to the market. So the only way that you can just fix it by printing money is by causing hyperinflation. So that's out. All right, well, what else could you do? Well, you can significantly cut spending and significantly raise taxes. This is, of course, obviously the thing that you really have to do at some point. But there's a problem with that, because when you significantly raise taxes and cut spending, the downside of that is that it kind of hinders your economic growth in the short term. Anytime you raise taxes, people have less money to spend, so they're going to spend less money out, giving it to the hands of businesses. And businesses, being taxed at a corporate rate or whatever, are going to lose money that they are not able to invest in expansion. And businesses not being able to invest in expansion means high unemployment, because people aren't going to be able to, there's not going to be any new demand for labor if people can't grow. So you raise taxes too much, you cripple the productivity of the economy, which causes unemployment. And then it's the opposite. Remember the last video we talked about the Laffer curve thing, where we actually made more money for the government by cutting taxes in the 80s? You would kind of have an opposite of that. If you raise the taxes too high, you're going to get a much larger percentage of a much smaller pie, and you might even wind up with less. Well, what about just cutting all the government spending? Well, when you do that, that is a major thing you're going to have to do. But even that's going to have a few issues, because that's going to affect, that is going to have a certain effect on the demand side of things. If you just ended all safety net programs overnight, that wouldn't have the same impact as some of the other things, because that's money that's not being taxed on their end. But at the same time, that's going to affect the people that would take their money, whether it's stores or what have you. So then, all right, well, what if you just said, we're not going to pay it. We're going to just pull the Michael Scott and just scream, I declare bankruptcy, right? Well, there's some problems that run with that too, because if you just say we're going to default on the debt, we're not going to pay it off, several bad things could happen. First off, that's going to hinder an awful lot of private citizens who own part of that debt. So a lot of that debt is people's retirement, because they invested in savings bonds and securities. And this is how they're going to, support themselves and retire. So that's a problem. More dangerous is all these foreign investors, some of these foreign governments that are investors. If we're at this state of weakness where we're having to default on the debt, then we probably have had to cut defense at some point already. We're probably not in great shape as a country, and some of these foreign powers may prove hostile to saying, hey, all those billions of dollars that you owe you, we're just not going to pay. They could respond with force. I mean, they could start a war over that. And ironically, what would we have to do if we had to fight a war over defaulting on the debt? We would have to dramatically increase defense spending, which would require borrowing. But we couldn't borrow because no one would be willing to lend us money. Because even if you take out the military invasion angle, if we're not capable, if we say we're not paying back our debtors, you're going to really hurt the markets right away, because people are invested in those. But also, you're going to prevent the possibility of ever being able to borrow again, because no one's going to want to buy government bonds if they don't think you can be trusted to pay them back. No one's going to buy them, which means that we'll have no means to pay for the functions of government. So if we just default and said, you know what, national debt is canceled, we're not going to pay it back. Well, next year, we're going to have to fund the government somehow. And you know, our only means of doing that are being able to cut spending and raise taxes dramatically simultaneously, which will contract the economy, or by running a deficit like we're doing. But the problem is we won't be able to borrow that money because no one will lend it to us, because we just defaulted on the national debt we already had. So we can't start a new tab. We can't say, I'm not going to pay the tab and then start a new one. So what would our options be at that point? It would be to go back and just print the $1 trillion coin, except that's going to cause hyperinflation that'll destroy the economy. Or we would have to so affect the cost of interest. We would have to so affect interest rates that no one would ever be able to borrow, and that would lead to a massive crash of production and expansion of businesses, which would lead to high unemployment. So there's really no fun answer. There's no good answer. We've painted ourselves into a corner that we can't get out of. At some point, we're going to have to start doing some tough things to prevent the worst case scenarios of this stuff, or it's going to be a financial crisis like we have never seen in our lives, and that's including what we just lived through. So the idea that people can just continue to ignore the national debt and continue to run $1 trillion deficits forever, and it's not going to be a problem, at some point in our lifetime, that system is going to come crashing down. It's going to implode, and it won't be pretty when it does. Right now, the problem is politicians keep kind of pushing it down the road because they're worried about getting elected in 2 years, and the eventual debt crisis may hit in 20 when they're out of politics. But at some point, all this the borrowing that we're doing, in reality, we're borrowing it from our children and future generations, because they're going to grow up in a world much less prosperous if we can't get the debt and deficit situation under control. And that is going to require probably, at times, that may require some tax increases. It definitely will require drastic cuts in spending. But there's no way to do it where you're not going to tick people off, because everyone has an interest in all the major things that are driving the economy, all the things that are driving the debt crisis. At some point, you're going to have to cut all of them back, and that, hey, I mean, like, look at defense spending. You don't want to cut back defense spending because that's like inviting people to invade. But on the other hand, if you don't make some cuts in it, it may be a situation where the national debt might be a bigger security threat than some of these other countries are. So it's a rough deal. I wish our leadership hadn't been moronic for the last several decades, but that's kind of where we are right now. So anyway, it is getting dark, so I guess I better move to the library setup here so that people can see me in the next one. But y'all take care, and I will see you around.